All right, so now we've talked about the architecture deployment. Now let's get into actually deploying Cloud Foundation. So for a lot of folks who are have looked at VCF in prior releases, you may be familiar with that component we call the Cloud Builder. And in VCF 9, the Cloud Builder has been replaced with a new appliance we call the VCF Installer. Okay, the VCF Installer is a relatively lightweight OVA. I think it's around 2 gig in size, maybe a little bit over, and it just gets deployed in the data center. And its requirements are that it needs to have network connectivity to the servers that are going to make up our management domain. And remember, that management domain is that first workload domain that gets created in a VCF instance. So we deploy the VCF installer, and one of the first things we'll need to do is we'll need to upload the binaries to the VCF installer. And I'll have a little bit more on this in an upcoming slide, but suffice it to say, we do support both an online connected mode as well as an offline disconnected mode. So this will work for dark sites as well as for connected sites. But once you upload those binaries, then you go in and you'll kick off the deployment. Now, for the deployment, you can follow the user interface provided by the VCF installer and have a guided interface that will walk you through all the necessary collecting all the necessary information needed to deploy Cloud Foundation, and and go through that process. Or you can also use an API with a corresponding JSON file if you want to automate this as well. So we do have support for both guided UI-driven workflow as well as an API-driven workflow with JSON as well. Both are supported. But essentially, regardless of which approach you're going to do, you go in and you'll start the deployment, and the VCF installer will then go in and using the input you provide, it will basically go through, identify the servers that will make up that management domain, and deploy that first workload domain, that first management domain inside that VCF instance. And so this VCF installer, again, lightweight, and this is how we're going to go about deploying Cloud Foundation. It makes deployment very easy for our customers. And a little bit more on the VCF installer appliance. So again, this is the appliance that we use to instantiate that first workload domain or that management domain. And it can also be used to deploy VVF and VCF. So if you hear a word about the VVF installer and the VCF installer, just keep in mind, is the same appliance. When you deploy, you choose which one you're going to use. It does the full stack. It's going to deploy everything from vSphere. If you're using vSAN, it will configure the vSAN data stores. It has support for both vSAN OSA and ESA, and it will configure NSX for you. And again, it has support for both the UI-driven workflow as well as the API-driven workflow using JSON as well. Now, I talked about the example I gave prior was an example where we're deploying new infrastructure. So we have some new hosts, new servers. We've installed ESXi on those, and we're going to use these new servers to stand up a new VCF instance or a new VCF management domain. And so it's very straightforward. We'll go in and we'll stand that up. And when it stands it up, keep in mind that this new VCF instance, in my examples, I'm going to use vSAN in all the examples. So I'm going to be calling out vSAN, but just keep in mind we do support NFS and fiber channel as well. So even though I'm saying vSAN, those other types of storage are supported. But assuming we're using vSAN, when we stand up a new management domain, the VCF installer is going to go through, it's going to configure vSphere, it's going to set up our NSX. And if we're deploying a new fleet, it will also go out and deploy VCF operations with the necessary VCF operations collector and the fleet management, a couple of new appliances, as well as deploy VCF automation. So it will go ahead and take care of deploying all those components. Now, in addition to be able to go out and to take new infrastructure, we also have the ability to basically point the VCF installer to an existing vSphere cluster and say, hey, use this existing vSphere cluster to create the management domain. So now we're not requiring customers to have to go and provision or purchase new hardware. We can basically say, hey, you already have vSphere running in your data center. You've already got vSphere clusters. So let's take one of those clusters and let's designate that as your VCF instance management domain. And we will basically take that existing vSphere environment and we will convert that into a management domain. And the way we do that is we take that existing environment, we bring it in, we configure it, we deploy NSX, and if we're doing a fleet, we would then deploy operations and automation. Now, there are some limitations with VCF 9.0 when it comes to importing existing infrastructure, or what the documentation is referring to as converging existing infrastructure into a VCF management domain. One of the limitations we'll have out the gate, and this will be a short-lived limitation, we hope, is that you cannot currently have NSX installed. If NSX is installed, you won't be able to import that yet. Wait for that to come in a future release. But Outside of that limitation, a couple other things you need to be aware of is you'll need to make sure that the vSphere version and the vSAN version is running 9. So you'll need to upgrade that environment to vSphere, vCenter 9, and ESXi 9 prior to doing the import. And if you're going to import an existing operations and existing automation, you'll need to upgrade those to 9 as well. So you'll need to use the fleet, you'll need to use the ARIA LCM to basically deploy the fleet manager appliance and then upgrade those components as well. So you will need to upgrade those environments to 9 before you can then import that or converge that into a VCF management domain. But that's kind of the overview on using the VCF installer. So again, kind of recap here. I feel like I've been talking a lot. Use the VCF installer to instantiate a VCF instance, to instantiate the management domain, as well as to instantiate a new VCF fleet. You can do that on new infrastructure, as well as you can take existing infrastructure and converge that into a VCF management domain. Now, with regards to the VCF installer, a couple of things we want to call out here, a couple of notes. I've touched on some of these, but just to underscore and make sure we understand, when you do deploy Cloud Foundation using the VCF installer, keep in mind that we do have support for both connected mode and disconnected mode. We call those the offline depot and the online depot. So you do the online depot, you basically just go in, you provide your software token, and it will go out and it will pull the necessary binaries from the public repository. If you use the offline depot, you'll need to go in and set up a local web server, or you'll need to manually upload those as well. But both are supported, so if you're a dark site, don't worry, the VCF installer will still work. It does have support for both the UI-driven, wizard-driven approach, as well as an API-driven approach using JSONs. And when you deploy a new instance, remember we talked about the VCF fleet and the VCF instance. You can choose whether you're going to deploy a new VCF fleet, meaning you're going to deploy a new instance of VCF operations and automation as part of this VCF instance, or whether you're going to be adding an existing VCF instance to an existing fleet, meaning you're going to deploy a new VCF instance, but you're going to register with an already deployed instance of operations and automation. Keep in mind that when you deploy a new VCF instance, it's always going to include a new vCenter server. It will always include NSX, and for fleets, it will always include ops and automation. Okay. And another thing to bring up here that I haven't discussed so far is this choice of deployment model. So with Cloud Foundation 9, we now offer two different deployment models. There's this idea of a simple model or a highly available model. And essentially what this is when you deploy Cloud Foundation, you can now choose whether you want to do a simple model where you deploy single node instances of each of the appliances. And so you have a smaller footprint, there's less components, there's less CPU, memory, storage requirements. And this works great for proofs of concepts, for testing, for dev, for lab environments. But keep in mind, you're sacrificing some of the resiliency and some of the potential availability when you go with the simple deployment model because you don't have that built-in redundancy like you do on the high availability approach, as you see on the right-hand side there. And you'll see when doing the high availability deployment, you'll see that things like the NSX managers, the VCF operations, VCF automation are deployed with built-in redundancy. So in the simple model, you're using vSphere HA to provide protection against failures. In the high availability, you're using a combination of vSphere HA for some components, but then you're also leveraging the inbuilt high availability capabilities of things like VCF Ops, NSX Manager, and VCF Automation. So you have that choice as well. Okay, so everything I've talked about up to this point when it comes to deploying Cloud Foundation has been talking about deploying a new VCF fleet or deploying a new VCF instance using the VCF installer. Okay, so now once I've stood up my VCF instance, how do I create workload domains? Now, in the past, you create workload domains by going to the SDDC Manager UI. And in VCF 9, we're still using the SDDC Manager, but what we've done is we've moved the capability from the SDDC Manager UI and into VCF operations. So you now go to VCF operations, and this is where you're going to deploy new workload domains. So you can go in to VCF operations under the inventory, and you'll be able to deploy a new workload domain on top of new infrastructure that's in your data center, so new ESXi host. In addition to being able to go in and deploy on top a new ESXi host, you can also import existing vSphere environments into the VCF instance using operations. Okay, and so when we're importing existing infrastructure, um, I mentioned some of the requirements when we were deploying a new VCF instance or a new VCF environment from the VCF installer, one of those being that you had to upgrade everything to VCF up to version 9. So you had to grade vSphere up to 9, you had to grade ops and automation up to 9. Well, when using the VCF operations to import infrastructure, you can import infrastructure that's running vSphere 8.0 and higher, as well as NSX 4.2 and higher. And you can import clusters that have NSX already configured. So here you'll see in the screenshot on the right, you have the ability to create a new workload domain as well as import a vCenter. And when you import a vCenter, it basically is going to scan that vCenter topology. It will make sure it meets the requirements to be imported. It will give you a list of any failed checks that you might need to address before you can import it. But once it passes that, it brings it in, and it will basically provide you with it'll basically take that existing vSphere environment, convert it into a VCF workload domain where I can now use the capabilities of VCF operations lifecycle management in order to do centralized password management, centralized certificate management. I can do patching and upgrading, as well as I can do scale activities like scale up and scale down and add clusters and do things like that. So keep in mind that when you do import a vCenter server, that if NSX is not already installed, it will be installed. One of the biggest questions we get asked is, do I have to deploy NSX? And with VCF 9, yes, every workload domain, the management domain, all VI workload domains will have NSX deployed as part of those. And if it's not already there, it will be deployed as part of the import. All right, so let's just kind of step back and think about, okay, this capability of importing existing infrastructure into Cloud Foundation using VCF operations. Why is this a good thing, and why is this something that we think customers will be excited about? Well, if you think of the data center before Cloud Foundation, you have a number of different vSphere clusters. They're kind of scattered throughout the data center. Some are running maybe version 7. One might be running one version of 8.0, maybe update 1. Another might be 8.0, update 3. One cluster might be running on standard switches, another might be running on vSphere distributed switches, another might be running NSX. And they might have, one cluster might have Kubernetes enabled, another might not, the supervisor enabled. So the point being is that they're kind of a hodgepodge of they're all vSphere clusters, but they have different configurations, different topologies, different versions. And in that environment, it can be very hard to manage it. It can be very expensive to maintain. Going in, doing patching and upgrading and having to kind of manually manage all that can be very time consuming. And so when you take these existing pools of infrastructure, these existing vCenter environments, vSphere environments, and you import it into Cloud Foundation, one of the first benefits you get is you're moving it to a standardized and centralized, a standardized deployment model with centralized operations. So I bring everything in. Now it's a workload domain. Everything's going to have a vSphere distributed switch with NSX. Everything's going to have a vCenter server, and it's all going to be managed as a single entity. That's going to make it easy for me to patch and upgrade, and make it easier for me to stay current on my versions. So it's easier for me to not fall behind because I use automation to provide patches, to apply patches and updates. And it's going to allow me to basically manage the same amount of infrastructure with a smaller number of resources in a more efficient way. And in addition, one thing we have to keep in mind is when we look at the before side, we look at these existing environments, a lot of them will have different configurations in terms of they might be using LACP, they might have single host in the inventory with single PNICs, they might be using different types of configurations that maybe weren't supported by Cloud Foundation in the past. And in the past, those would be problematic to import. But with VCF 9, we've relaxed a lot of those guardrails, and we're allowing those environments to come over with these additional components without blocking the import. And so while we still won't manage those, and while the VCF, we still won't be able to provide automation around those capabilities, we can coexist with those capabilities, which will help make it a lot easier for our customers to take those existing environments and get them into Cloud Foundation to start benefiting primarily from the lifecycle management and the centralized operations capabilities without having to make a lot of changes to their existing infrastructure. So it's really about putting a lot of work into meeting customers where they are to help them on their journey to the private cloud with VMware Cloud Foundation with less roadblocks and less barriers to adoption. Okay, we've talked about VCF operations. We talked about how I can go into operations and I can now create workload domains, and how that functionality used to be tied to the SDDC Manager UI. Well, in addition to that, we've also moved additional capabilities of the SDDC Manager UI directly into the vSphere client. So when it comes to importing and creating workload domains, I can go to operations. But once those workload domains have been created, And once they're in my VCF inventory, I can now go right into the vSphere client where I can then do day two operations like expanding clusters, adding new clusters, deploying edge nodes, configuring vSphere Kubernetes service. Those things are all done from the user interface that we all know and love, that being the vSphere client. And so this kind of gives an example here where I can log into the vSphere client. Here I have my VCF environment running with a single domain. And you'll see I have a number of VS hosts out there in my inventory, and I want to go in and I want to basically make add a new cluster or make it a cluster bigger. I can go into the vSphere client now without having to go to a separate UI, and I can do this all from within the vSphere client. And so there's some new capabilities built directly into the vSphere client to support this. And again, as we've already discussed, while I go in, I can do the day two operations like scaling up and scaling out and expanding those workload domains. Keep in mind that I still centralized manage, they're still centrally managed from VCF operations, where I continue to monitor the health and performance of those.